Hello. This topic I'm going to discuss is why do so many people take drug overdoses? And is there a hidden secret reality to it all? Now, this comes at age 60 in my life from a lot of personal experience. I'm not going to go into a lot of details at present, but I have met so many people who have lost either relatives from drug overdoses or who have tried it themselves. And I'll just leave it at that this is more than just a passing problem in our society. And while it's blamed a lot of times on drugs like fentanyl or heroin, certain drugs in particular, the question in my mind, and I think we should all take a look at, is whether these are, first of all, accidental, and whether they're even attempts at suicide, sometimes successful. Or rather, whether what we're talking about is attempts, sometimes successful, at self-euthanasia due to life situations that are so impossible to live through that this is sometimes a merciful way out of life, arguably, for a number of people. And I'll go into why I explain that, why I say that, and tie this in with the concept of wage slavery, too. Something we hear more and more about all the time. Now, we all know that a number of people have great challenges in childhood. They may have what you might call abuse, and it can be quite serious and traumatizing. Or they might grow up under extremely adverse circumstances in urban areas, ghettos, etc., gang warfare all around. They might get wrapped up with drug use as teenagers, or become pregnant as a teenager and have a lot to deal with after that. Or they may drop out of school early as a result of all of this sometimes. But do later attempts in their life to end their life with drug overdoses stem from what so many would call a mental illness or addiction problem that is, say, untreated or improperly treated? Or is there something more behind it? Like, for instance, oftentimes being stigmatized one way or another, either from going to prison, say, or seeking official help and being termed mentally ill after that point. And this stigma alone being so traumatizing to them, so difficult to work with in everyday life, that life is basically impossible for many. Or that's how you might put it. That life is so marginal, so straining, that you could argue a person is insane to keep going. Now, if you were to read literature on people who have spent time in prison, for instance, Michael Santos, who spent about 26 years in prison for cocaine charges around the age of 20, you would see that most all people in prison figure that it's going to be quite hopeless when they get out. And in fact, it is made rather challenging, to say the least, when they do exit because of the parole program that requires them to have gainful employment very quickly, or they'll be put right back where they came from. So many people exiting prison, in fact, are told by guards, that they'll be back very soon, 30 days, say. Well, why is that? Because they know that they're exiting with a stigma, amongst other things, but a stigma that is going to cause a whole lot of people to feel afraid of them and deem them to be bad employees. Bad employees, that is, unless they have invented a better mousetrap, so to speak, something so phenomenal that no, quote, ex-convict has ever come up with, that the person exiting prison would be heralded as a genius and come up with an instant success worth millions overnight. But barring that, these individuals deemed rather questionable in terms of character and broken like Humpty Dumpties. Now, of course, many or most of these people coming out of prison would be shunted into the mental health system for so-called assistance. But I would say that that assistance consists in large part of garnering a mental health illness label that is very stigmatizing, very scary to the public. And secondly, I bet you that 99.9% of them will be taking drugs, often forced to take them for life, in fact. And this too will be highly stigmatizing and corroborate a so-called mental illness diagnosis, therefore reinforcing thoughts in the public that these people are dangerous, especially if they were to so-called go off their meds. And furthermore, I would hesitate or not hesitate to say that almost all people coming out of prison would not go to rural areas, but instead go to urban areas looking for work. They probably were incarcerated in urban areas to start with. So urban areas would be very stressful, and in 99% of cases, at a minimum, I think they'd end up in an apartment complex so stressful that alone would be very demoralizing and difficult to work through for anybody. And it wouldn't help then that they would find many of their own people, so to speak, from similar circumstances as neighbors. And the bitterness in these people would be reinforcing and make it all the more difficult for them to come to terms with what you might call putting the past in the past and developing a better attitude that would be better for everybody concerned in society. But I think while this is somewhat understandable to many, there are maybe 3, 4, or 5 other categories that I believe some people fall into that are just as equally stigmatizing. For instance, anybody who seeks help for emotional struggles or struggles in living is likely to be termed mentally ill. And once that label is applied to them, and especially if they believe that label, and third, if it's told that it has a biological or genetic component, that they are in essence told, for starters, that it's for life and incurable, and told that the only purpose for therapy, in fact, is to make sure they stay on their meds. No other reason. And that, of course, forgets psychoanalysis or depth therapy or anything further than 10 sessions of cognitive behavioral therapy in general. That it would be pointless and hopeless because they are told they have a genetic problem, or, as people are told these days coming out of rehab, that they have a dual diagnosis. In other words, they went in with a addiction and they come out with a treated addiction on some other drug, plus being told they have a genetic component that is incurable. And why would anyone want to work through any kind of trauma issues or issues about housing or or anything else difficult in life, including no jobs that they've ever been trained for, if in fact they're told they have a genetic component that can't be overcome. Now, a third category would be anyone who has gone to rehab. Those coming out would always tend to say that they are in recovery and for the rest of their life. And many employers would tend to shy away from hiring such people unless they have exceptional skills that the average person never going to rehab simply doesn't have to offer. Now, of course, many people who come out of rehab do relapse, even when taking prescription drugs that they've been prescribed upon exiting. But what causes these these relapses? Is it something genetic in them, or did their treatment and rehab fail to address the roots of the problem? And basically they were just taking a little vacation there, away from the life situations that were so toxic, and giving relatives of these people a chance to recuperate as well for a spell of a few weeks or a month. But after the person exits, 99% of the time, I think they go right back into the situation they came from. Therefore, kind of getting reinfected, as if acquiring bed bugs or lice in your hair, having it treated chemically, and then going back and sleeping in the same bed or on the sofa that you got infected from in the first place. Unless you kill the roots of the problem, or in other words, have your linens dry cleaned or sofa removed and replaced, a person naturally is going to get reinfected. You could say then reinfection can occur very easily and generally by going back to your old neighborhood and your old friends and urban life once again, which is very stressful. So I'm not even talking issues of whether a person has a job or not. And of course, a person going to rehab for the first time entered with no stigma label of being a rehab attendee, shall we say, but when they come out, they have the stigma of having attended. So they have all these sorts of issues to deal with. And of course, any kind of employment they might get then will be minimum wage work, usually, and often unstable. And so how can you even survive and grow on an emotional basis under those conditions? I think nobody on earth can basically handle that. You'd have to be Houdini or a saint, or Einstein perhaps. Now, yet another category that is highly stigmatizing is if you are of a certain race from another country and you come here. And for whatever reasons, you may be stigmatized, particularly if you're accused of taking jobs from Americans. Regardless of whether you can do the job much better, or you're more reliable, or have better ethics, or better empathy levels, higher empathy. That not mattering to some people who would simply be very angry that someone from a foreign country has come in and taken their job, theoretically anyway. And so we find, for instance, some people saying that Mexicans who come to this country carry diseases from having swum the Rio Grande to get here, that they acquired a disease in the water and therefore are a danger to society. And this probably isn't the only type of stigmatizing rumor that goes around concerning people from foreign countries coming here, depending largely on whether they're here illegally or not. But that not really having an impact on how well they can do jobs, and whether they can in fact do them oftentimes better than citizens who are here and born here. And then finally, there is the situation of those who are termed pedophiles, which can cover, by the way, I believe, a large spectrum of people. And the only thing it has in common at all is a sexual component. But beyond that, the sky's the limit as to the broadness of this category. But once a person is acquiring that label and has to register as a sex offender, I would say in many cases these people are ruined for life from the get-go. And it takes special fortitude for them to survive in society. In fact, if we're to consult one or more websites that help people with this label, we would find some people posting comments asking for help trying to decide whether to end their life because the stigma is so bad that they're basically pariahs in society. And really, they're finding it quite intolerable. So then, where does all this stigma come from? Especially if much of it doesn't have a foundation, or if people who have gotten in some kind of trouble could have often come out the other end and put their life back together, if not for the stigmatizing element and the problems with housing, getting decent housing and a decent living wage job. Well, I would say, first of all, I don't want to use the word paranoia, but it is true, I believe, that a good number of people in our society in particular are afraid of anything, quote, out of the ordinary. They catastrophize things very easily, and anything that has the moniker or look of being a little unreliable or more can churn up a lot of feelings of fright and what I would call catastrophe scenarios. And secondly, if we were to examine the topic of scapegoating, going way back to the biblical days and up to the present too, I believe one would find that many people in certain sectors would like to have a scapegoat, sometimes a community scapegoat, or let's say a family scapegoat. And what better way to scapegoat someone than by their fitting into one of these categories I've talked about already. Now, I would say that unfortunately, and probably very little discussed, except for a snippet I once heard by Russell Brand in England, who once struggled with an addiction and was once an actor and is now making some headway in England on these issues. There is, I believe, an unconscious process of using people with these stigmas I've talked about to serve as what we call wage slaves, people who will do very undesirable jobs for very little to no money, basically. In other words, even doing jobs almost for free just to keep from going to prison, or to keep off the streets and then go to prison. And finally, as I alluded to earlier, most everybody in these situations is told they have a mental illness and with a genetic component. And the percentage factor of that genetic component is never specified, but it is implied that they will never get over this, and that if they were to try therapy, the only reason to do so would be to make sure they stay on their, quote, meds. And really, that other than that, things are hopeless. And thus, how is anybody supposed to grow and have any hope in general if they're told things are hopeless, basically? Indeed, if one were to consult manuals on why people commit suicide, counselors will tell people right up front that people who call hotlines for suicidal ideations do so basically for one reason: hopelessness. And with regard to these drug overdoses, then, doesn't it stand to reason it's just possible that people who acquire a stigma that many people find frightening, and to the extent that there is also a tacit idea that if these people, quote, go off their meds, they could go postal and shoot up a movie theater or bomb someplace, and fears run amok in general publicity, then arguably I would say there is little reason for hope for certain people thus stigmatized. And again, I would say that it almost could be conceived that a person is rather lacking in judgment to continue in life indefinitely under these circumstances. Indeed, consider the man who shot Mr. Reagan one time. Was his name Mr. Hinckley? Well, he spent many, many years either in prison or locked up. And I would venture to say that even if he had had a complete turnaround, that he would have been forced to be taking psychiatric drugs for the rest of his life. And one of the major reasons why he was probably never released was because the general public was scared that if he, quote, went off his, quote, medications, he could resume doing things that were considered a danger to society. And people not wanting to take that kind of risk, especially if catastrophizing in general, catastrophizing type people. And so here is a challenge I would usher out, and some thoughts to bring up here. And that would be, first of all, is it really provable that everybody going to rehab, or everybody who went to prison, or everybody who gets a mental health diagnosis, etc., has a strong biological component that, of course, then could arguably be said not to be overcomable? Where is the definitive proof on this? And without definitive proof, is it justifiable to declare that there's a genetic component that can't be overcome, when this results in stigmatization that basically wrecks the life of everyone who receives these diagnoses? Wrecks it to the point that many of them may attempt suicide, and some of them succeed. Yes, is there sufficient proof of that genetic basis to warrant giving a stigmatizing label that will basically end their life in many a fashion? And secondly, is there sufficient proof, beyond a shadow of a doubt, to tell people they have a strong genetic component for troubles they've been in life, so to speak, and thus tell these people that the hope of them growing in general as human beings is basically nil, zero, thus destroying hope? Is there sufficient proof? And finally, and I leave this to the end because what I will say may have may be very important to bring up, and that is, if someone coming out of some kind of facility, a prison, a mental hospital, or even a psychiatrist's office, and being told they're mentally ill, or coming out of a rehab center, these in particular, if such people are termed a potential danger to society, especially if they, quote, went off their, quote, medications, well, then I would ask one simple question. That question is this: are these the most potentially dangerous people in our society by a long shot? Or could there just possibly be a number of people, I mean a considerable number of people, who have never entered any kind of these facilities and were born and raised in America and never had any sex charges made against them? Are such people sometimes very numerous in number and much more of a potential danger to our society than the people I've been talking about? In other words, how much criminal activity goes on that you might call white-collar crime, and in fact might sometimes go on right in front of our faces on a daily level and in very commonplace fashion. Furthermore, how many of these people might actually acquire medals or possibly even a Nobel Prize and publish books and hit the New York Times bestseller list describing activities they've done that they get venerated for or receive no negative comment on, and impact lives all around them to a fashion that would make fears of what a person coming out of prison for any kind of a charge or any kind of person deemed, quote, mentally ill, a ludicrous thing. How many people, in fact, have gotten medals for killing millions of people or possibly endangering our environment to the point where our planet may go extinct, as far as humans are concerned anyway? So I bring these up as thoughts to consider. They're not very pretty thoughts, I think, but I bring this up to point out that sometimes I believe a lot of the stigmatizing going on, first of all, may have no basis, and second of all, may be in the purposes unconsciously usually of creating wage slaves, and third, that it can often be ignoring the 10-ton elephants in the room as to who the real dangers to society are. Not someone who has hurt, to some degree, a few people, but who are the people who are a danger to an entire country and may even bring upon us nuclear war or degradation of the environment to an extent that our species goes extinct sometime. Maybe we don't want to cover these topics in the news, and so we look for scapegoat issues even, and scapegoat targets. I know this is going to be controversial and troubling to hear for some, but I would be surprised if anyone didn't find this information at least useful, and that it might resonate on some levels in almost everybody. And for goodness sake, I believe the level of people taking drug overdoses is such an epidemic high, and the number of people in prison so numerous, it being said by one neuroscientist currently on YouTube that 1 in 3 African Americans has spent time in prison. So this is not some small issue here, and neither is the whole topic of wage slavery. I wish you well.